Good morning. My name is Maureen Scott, and I'm the Events and Activities Coordinator for the Learning Resource Center South. I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Autism and Neurodiversity in the Inclusive Setting with Dr. Amy Accardo. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Learning Resource Center South at Rowan University, which is a partnership with the New Jersey Department of Education, Office of Special Education. We're proud to be a part of the Learning Resource Centers network, which includes 3 centers in New Jersey. We have South, Central, and North. The Learning Resource Centers foster achievement of all students with disabilities, their families, and the educational professionals who work with them as they pursue the goal of increasing opportunities and improving educational outcomes in special education. Please check the chat box for links to the LRC-South website and the LRC network to find a location near you. I'd like to go over a few things about the setup for today's webinar. If you've joined us in the past, you've heard this before, and if you haven't, welcome. Today's presentation is being recorded. Please give us about a week to send you a link to the recorded presentation. Closed captioning will be available on the recorded version. As attendees, you are in listen and view only mode. So this means your audio is muted and your image will not show on the screen. But we do still want to hear from you. Today, we will be using 3 Zoom features for interaction. We'll be using polling, chat, and Q&A. As far as the polling, our presenter will let you know when she would like you to answer multiple choice questions. The poll questions will pop up on your screen and you can select your response. The chat is open for all and we encourage discussion. To interact in the chat, please click the chat option and then select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down box so that everybody can see what you are sharing or what you are asking. And then please select that each time that you put something in the chat so that, again, it shares out to everybody. And we will also be putting links in the chat to share different things as we go along. For the Q&A feature, we ask that you use that feature to ask specific questions to our presenter, Dr. Amy Accardo. And Dr. Accardo said that she will address questions periodically throughout the presentation. So as we move through and you think of questions, please share them as we go along. You don't need to hold them to the end, share them so that we can take a moment and ask Dr. Accardo for her responses to your questions. As far as evaluations go, your feedback is very valuable to us, so we ask that you complete the survey evaluation, which will pop up as you're exiting the webinar. Your input helps us to know how we're doing and it guides our future plans. You will need to complete that evaluation in order for us to send you a certificate of completion. And once you complete the eval, we will take, please allow us about a week. We tried to get them out sooner, but allow us about a week to get the certificate emailed out to you. And now a little bit about today's presenter. Dr. Amy Accardo is an assistant professor in the Interdisciplinary and Inclusive Education Department at Rowan University's College of Education. Dr. Accardo's scholarly activities focus on promoting equitable education opportunities for individuals on the autism spectrum. She strives to eliminate barriers to post-secondary education and to reduce the research to practice gap, teaching reading comprehension and writing to autistic students. Please check the chat box for a link to a more detailed bio on Dr. Accardo. And now just give me 1 second as we hand things over to today's presenter, Dr. Amy Accardo.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our web series. We're excited to have you with us. As you know, today our topic is autism and neurodiversity in the inclusive setting. I do want to reiterate what Maureen shared. I really encourage you to use the chat or Q&A. I really am so happy that we have Zoom to allow us to connect, but so it's less of a lecture and more interactive, please feel free to add comments, questions, and the team will help focus me so that I answer those and so that we can engage in multiple ways. In terms of our agenda today, we're going to start with the basics of neurodiversity, and that includes definitions, the use of language, and then we're going to move into how neurodiversity connects to social justice, as well as the need for neurodiversity in education, specifically special education, and that will be the majority of our focus. We will then, towards the end, talk about the need for respectfully providing accommodations and support services for students, as well as using universal design for learning as a means to doing that. And we'll just touch the surface of those areas. And if you all are interested, that's something that we can engage in perhaps a future webinar. So to get started, I wanted to start with a poll so that you all know, where you are in terms of other participants in this group, and so that I know as well. So we have a question here, which is, which option best describes your connection to neurodiversity? So the LRC team is going to help here pull up the poll feature so that you can select the multiple choice question that best supports your description or your connection to neurodiversity. Hopefully you all see that and you can select a multiple choice option. I understand I can see the results so far in live time. If you could take just about 5 more seconds to respond to the poll, and then we'll share the results. Okay, and LRC team, I'm okay with just sharing out what I can see here for the larger group. I see a lot of people are probably still getting ready to participate here, but the majority selected that they are both a professional educator as well as have a personal connection to neurodiversity. And I would like you to know I stand with you there. I'm in that same group. So I was a middle school special education teacher for 15 years before coming to Rowan University. And I also have in my family a personal connection to neurodiversity. Beyond that, the majority of you have indicated that you are general and or special educators, and that is pretty evenly split. So now I know we're primarily teachers, probably of all different grade levels, and that is hopefully helpful information to you as well, so you know what type of relevant questions to ask and answer. Okay, so I'm going to keep you engaged here. As we go to the next slide, my directions for you, if you haven't done so already, is to grab a piece of paper and a pen. I want you to work through this anticipation guide with me. This is a formative assessment and also a self-assessment for you. So I know what to really reinforce in our first few sections of our agenda. So what I'd like you to do is don't worry about the chat box feature yet, but on your piece of paper, number 1 through 6, and as I read each statement to you out loud, I want you to just jot down the word agree or disagree, or A and D for agree and disagree. Okay? So statement number 1, person first language is the preferred language for self-advocates on the autism spectrum. Agree or disagree? Statement number 2, the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for autism distinguishes between high functioning and low functioning. So for example, indicates a spectrum. Agree or disagree? So all you're doing is writing agree or disagree down on a piece of paper that you have. Don't worry about anything else yet. Statement number 3, the neurodiverse student may be reluctant to disclose their disability to others. Do you agree or disagree? Number 4, ableism is the practice of accommodating for people with disabilities to allow them to be successful. Agree or disagree? Number 5, camouflaging is when a neurodivergent person behaves in ways to pass as neurotypical. Agree or disagree? And finally, nationally, 1 in 54 children are diagnosed with autism, with New Jersey having the highest rate, 1 in 31 children diagnosed, and that's 1 in 20 boys and 1 in 85 girls. Agree or disagree? Okay, so what I would like you to do now is, if you agree with all 6 statements, do nothing. But if you disagree with any of those statements, put the number only of the statements you disagree with in the chat. So for example, if I disagree with number 2 and 4, I'm going to put 2,4 in the chat. So I'm looking for you to simply put numbers of statements you disagree with in the chat box. I see 2, I see 4, I see 6. I'll wait a few minutes for others to participate. Okay, and for those of you catching up, you can feel free to keep putting those numbers in the chat. At this point, I do see a pattern with the diagnostic criteria, the functioning levels, with the statement about ableism, and also with the incidence data. So I'll keep that in mind as we move through. And what we'll do is we'll come back to this anticipation guide after we cover some of this material, and we'll look at each statement again. And I will share with you at that point, you know, what I'm thinking in terms of agreement and where it should be. Okay, that's very helpful. All right, so moving forward here into our content of the first section, neurodiversity, the basics, we want to define neurodiversity as recognizing brain differences as a natural human variation. So it's important to stress that neurodiversity is a fact. It's not a theory or a way of thinking. It's a fact that there is diversity of human brains and that there is no one type of human brain. So I want to draw attention to this quote that I selected from the National Symposium on Neurodiversity at Syracuse University. Neurodiversity is a concept where neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. These differences can include those labeled with dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADHD, dyscalculia, autism, Tourette syndrome, and others. You can see similar disability labels in the graphic on the right. So I also want to stress here that neurodiversity is not exclusionary, and it really includes individuals with the vast range of differences, essentially anyone with a natural brain variation. So within that, we could also include mental health differences. So someone with generalized anxiety disorder, cerebral palsy, many additional disability labels can fit into this category of neurodiversity as well. Let's consider the key assumptions of the neurodiversity paradigm. So it's a fact that neurological diversity is a natural form of human variation and that there's not one normal type of brain. The neurodiversity paradigm is essential because it provides us with a philosophical foundation for social justice activism. And with that philosophical foundation, we can add what we value, what we honor, what we respect. So starting with the third bullet point here, focusing on the neurodiversity paradigm, all forms of neurological diversity are valued. Neurological diversity should be honored. Neurodivergent people include those benefiting from all levels of support. And my favorite, the last bullet point here, disabilities are understood through a lens that filters out social prejudice and deficit language. So I want to back up a minute, and before we get a little deeper into neurodiversity language, let's talk about two areas of language that surround disability in general. The first is the use of person-first versus identity-first language, and then the second is use of functioning levels versus support levels. So in terms of person-first versus identity-first language, and specifically what we should call individuals who are autistic, we know as educators that we have been taught, and we still teach our education students through teacher preparation programs, typically, to use person-first language. And we've done that as professionals because we have the belief that it's important not to define any individual by their disability. In fact, I feel like sometimes as an educator, I've become like the person-first language police, right? If I hear a news flash on TV and they're talking about disability, or, you know, I remember at one point Obama was speaking about disability, and, you know, I'm keying in on who's using person-first language and immediately notice when people don't use it. I don't know if you all do that as well. Interesting that over the last decade and more recently the last couple of years, this is starting to shift. And I'm bringing it up because it's important that we have awareness of this. And the shift is that self-advocates, specifically autistic self-advocates, have really begun to voice a preference for identity language instead. And they do that because they feel that autism is a trait like any other traits that define their identity, like race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, disability. They feel that that's part of their identity. So this creates a tension. What language do we use, and how do we know what language to use? And I don't have all the answers there, but as educators and as education researchers like I am, I think it's really important that we think about this. So the real guidance that we have is to make sure that we ask the person's preference, whether this is a student that we're talking about in an IEP meeting or someone that we're working with out in the community. Whenever possible, talking to people about their preference is the best way to go about deciding what language to use. When that's not possible, what we often do is now shift the language use, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. I want to point out here that in the Google Drive resources folder that you all should have access to, there are about 5 different documents in there. One of them is titled Advocacy and Self-Advocacy. And the first 2 or 3 links in that reference have to do with language and language use. One is a blog by an autistic self-advocate, Nick Walker. Another one is the Autism Self-Advocacy Network link. That's also the link that you see here on this screen. That's pretty big here. So you have these resources to look back at, and also to share with colleagues and to maybe talk with colleagues about, so that everybody's using the same kind of language. So what I just mentioned a moment ago, that one of the best practices to do is to shift language, I want to share an example of that. So here is an article that I published recently in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. The research journals and the education journals are starting to come up with preferred language use for disabilities. So they're even saying things for autism like, the preference now is to not use the word disorder. So even though the DSM specifies autism spectrum disorder, we're now using or removing that word disorder. They also talk about using autistic and on the autism spectrum as preferred. So what I want to draw your attention to is, you know, what we did here, my research group, as well as what I see now, you know, very often, is putting a statement to be explicit about your language use. So what you can see here in the oval at the bottom, circled in red, is we put on our paper, we use the terms on the autism spectrum and autistic interchangeably to show acceptance of both professional use of person-first language, as well as preference of the neurodiversity community for identity-first language. So showing you how we sort of get around that and what we do. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to talk about in terms of person first and identity first language. Then the second general disability language conversation that I wanted to hit is that functioning level versus support level piece of language. You guys did pretty well there on that anticipation guide, because this is one of the questions you disagreed with. I asked, did the DSM diagnostic criteria mention high functioning and low functioning? And many of you disagreed, and that's great because it does not, and those are not terms that any of us should be using. Those are outdated terms. So the diagnostic criteria for autism requires deficits in social communication, as well as restricted repetitive patterns of behavior. And it does talk about multiple levels of autism, but it talks about them in terms of support levels and the amount of support that a student benefits from. So for those of you who are maybe just beginning to work in autistic support classrooms or with students with autism inclusive settings, this is important language to be aware of. And the reason that we don't want to use high and low functioning is because it really does not consider the variation in capability and capacity that individuals with autism have across multiple traits and or multiple environments. So an example of that, you have a student who has sensory sensitivity. They may need significant support to be in the gym while there are multiple teams playing volleyball, or to eat lunch in the cafeteria. They may only benefit from minimal support, though, in reading class. So sometimes it's the environment that turns that impairment into a disability. Adding to that, when we use levels such as high functioning and low functioning, it puts the onus of disability on the person instead of considering that it could be disability that is exacerbated by an environment or setting. Okay. We'll talk more about barriers that disable socially constructed barriers as we talk about models of disability in a few slides. So adding to this idea of functioning, Rebecca Burgess, who is a self-advocate autistic and has developed this image, she actually has developed, it's about an 8-page comic if you pull it up online, and I really appreciate and like this because she's created sort of a beautiful graphic instead of a linear visual image of functioning. So what she talks about is that when people think about autism and high and low functioning, they often visualize a line, and then in their mind think about where someone fits on that high-low functioning line. But if instead we think about supports and how people benefit from supports and how individuals with autism have different strengths, we can look at an image like this. We can put multiple traits around the circle. So you see that Rebecca is indicating here that some traits create difficulties. For example, perhaps she has some difficulties in motor skills, but perhaps she has strength here in the blue-purple section in perception. So sort of redefining the way we visualize and think about autism. We hear a lot now the term rethinking autism is important. So in terms of the general language around disability, before we get back to neurodiversity specifically, what are some of the bigger takeaways? And I place some terms, some phrases that we often hear connected to disability here in red. So nothing about us without us. That's like the rallying cry of disability self-advocates now for decades. No pity, no praise. It's important that we realize that people with disabilities don't want to be our inspiration. They also don't want us to pity them. And you all likely know this as educators. But what we really need to stress are the last two here: participatory decision-making and collaboration and communication with people with disabilities. So when we start to get into thinking about disability as diversity and disability justice, we can't establish that without the voices and the input of people with disabilities themselves. So participatory decision-making in schools, checking in with students who are willing to talk about being neurodivergent and are willing to give input in terms of school policies and procedures is really important and something that I want to encourage from the onset. So moving back to our focus on language specific to neurodiversity, those of you who participated in that like 15-minute webinar preview already played around with some of these terms, right? So let's take a look at the first two on the left, neurodiverse and neurodiversity. There are more general terms. So neurodiverse refers to a group. Groups are neurodiverse. So for example, at our university, we may say we have a neurodiverse student population because we're talking about the fact that we have students with brain differences. Just like we may say we have a diverse student population, and often when we say that, we're referring to race and ethnicity, right? Neurodiversity in the same way. We have a great, respect the neurodiversity of students on our campus. Looking to the right side of the table here, neurodivergent, however, is the term used to describe one person. So I may use it to say, for example, I have a neurodivergent student in my third period algebra class, and he, solved the problem creatively. What I wouldn't do is say my neurodiverse student is a creative thinker, because one student doesn't have multiple brains, right? So one student can't be neurodiverse. Neurodivergent is the term for one student, or for yourself. If you're neurodivergent, you may identify as neurodivergent. So thinking about the complexity of this language is important as educators, so we get it right. Neurotypical then would be the opposite of neurodivergent. We have pretty much covered person first language and identity first language, as well as the language use around autism. But I also want to point out that often people use the opposite of autistic as neurotypical, and that's really not an opposite either. So really the opposite of autistic would be non-autistic, right? Because you may not be autistic, but for example, you may have a label of ADD. So you may still not be neurotypical. So nuances of language are important for us as educators. And I do want to say that our university is really working to start a neurodiversity center, and we're really excited about that. So one thing that we've been doing is having a lot of large group meetings now through Zoom, but it's interesting how much work we all need with this language, and that's part of what's drawing my attention to it. And some people are on the defensive about it, and we realize we just need to laugh and sort of work through it together and learn it together. And now instead, what we're doing is, we're sharing resources. We're having little professional learning communities where we share articles, different blogs that talk about this language use, so we make sure we get it right. And I want to encourage you to maybe take some of these resources and do the same things in your schools. Okay. So coming back to the key assumption of the neurodiversity paradigm, and specifically that disabilities are understood through a lens that filters out social prejudice and deficit language, the really most important takeaway here is that neurodiversity always takes a strengths perspective. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to it, especially because I also have personal connection to individuals who are neurodivergent. So neurodiversity takes a strengths perspective, and this is a really great graphic because you can see it links disability labels around that center graphic with some potential or common strengths that go along with those disability labels. So I will often work with people on the autism spectrum, and so I can easily say strengths that go along with autism are honesty, dependability, amazing memory for factual information, names, dates, ability to concentrate and to work for long periods of time, fine detail processing. Individuals with ADHD, I can say, are very creative, often socially, the leaders, people want to be around them because they're very energetic and passionate, and people feel that, right? So focusing on these strengths is something that is interestingly really leading to a lot of corporations now reaching out purposefully to hire individuals who are neurodivergent for these unique strengths and to get a diversity in their workforce. I'm not actively watching the chat here, so LRC team, feel free to stop me if anybody's asking questions or putting specific comments. All right, I'll keep going and jump into social justice and neurodiversity, and then I'm going to stop and ask you guys some specific chat questions in a few minutes. So what is this connection of neurodiversity to social justice? We know that the neurodiversity movement is something that began with the autism rights movement, and actually that term neurodiversity itself was coined by an autistic self-advocate, Judy Singer, back in the 1990s. So while we think this is new at times, this has really been going on, 25 to 30 years. It's not something new. And it's a movement based on the philosophy for embracing differences as diversity. And what you want to think about is it's sort of taking people with physical disability. So for example, thinking about, someone in a wheelchair and knowing that we need to change the environment, change the social dynamic, get rid of staircases, use ramps, have, ADA laws to make sure that there is accessibility. How do we transfer that now to brain differences? That's what we really want to think about with social justice and the neurodiversity movement. So really what I mean by that is the neurodiversity movement applies the same idea of removing socially constructed barriers that disable people with physical disabilities to removing socially constructed barriers for people with brain differences. You can see I have it in small print here in the center. A link to Nick Walker's blog again. That's one I mentioned that's on the advocacy and self-advocacy reference in that Google Drive that I shared with you all. And to read what Nick states here, the neurodiversity movement is a social justice movement that seeks civil rights, equality, respect, and full societal inclusion for the neurodivergent. So within that, I want to talk about two models of disability. And these models are important because the medical model of disability is really what special education is rooted in, and the neurodiversity movement is rooted in the social model of disability. So looking at the medical model bullet points first here. Medical model of disability stems from the medical field. Individuals with a disability are given a label to access services and treatments. So we can agree that this is the model for special education. Just like you may have a diagnosis of cancer, leukemia, that's how you get hospitalization and health insurance. We have really set up a system where you need to have a diagnosis of a disability following IDEA in order typically to get an IEP or a 504 plan to get accommodations, right? You need to have that disability label. This medical model views disability as a deficit with a person's body or mind. So typically the focus of this model and also of special education is remediating the deficit. The shift to the social model is that the social model shifts the focus from disability as a deficit to disability that is something that is often socially constructed. So the social model separates impairment, which would be the person's functional limitation. So maybe, again, a person is autistic and has sensory issues, right? So that may be their limitation. It separates that from disability, the barriers that are imposed on them. So placing them in that crowded gym really is what turns that impairment into a disability at times. So the last bullet point here, the social model recognizes that societal barriers can exacerbate impairments and increase disability. Okay. So really, in other words here, it's often the policies, the procedures, the systems that are in place that can be more disabling for any given individual. And an example of that perhaps would be if you have a teenager with ADHD and maybe you're a middle school teacher and they really excel doing hands-on learning and working in a science lab. But then when they are expected to be in a 90-minute, what would you call it, like a lecture hall or something type format where they have to take notes and listen, they really are not going to have an easy time of it, right? So we have to think about those environments and those social settings and how they impact people as individuals. Okay, so just to point out, there are also several other models of disability here. I'm keying in on the medical and social model again because of their connections to special education and neurodiversity. But there's also a cultural model, which is very popular with the deaf community. There's a socio-relational model. There are many different models. And because I have special passion for autism and interest in autism, I also have really looked into models of disability, and I try to follow the work of autistic self-advocates. And there's one Australian autistic self-advocate that I really like. If we do a full day webinar, we'll look at her TED Talk and read her article. And her name's Jacqueline Den Houding. You'll see she's referenced throughout this PowerPoint here as well. So I'm going to read you something that she wrote here about the different models. So Den Houding states, most advocates within the neurodiversity movement are proponents of the social model of disability, as this model describes well the experiences of many autistic people. Even for those autistic people with the highest support needs, disability can be minimized or avoided through environment change and the provision of appropriate assistive tools. Importantly, to minimize disability for autistic people, both the physical and social environments require change. I think I like this statement a lot because to me it's that connection between neurodiversity and special education that I'm sort of always seeking. And this is what we do as special educators, right? We provide appropriate assistive tools. We change the environment when we can to make sure that we're supporting our individuals who are neurodivergent. And again, thinking about the physical and social environments and how we can change them is something that we're pretty comfortable doing. So one last graphic here to consider again these models of disability. Here's a person with a physical disability, and you see on the right side taking the viewpoint of someone with the social model of disability. The stairs are the problem, they should build a ramp. And that's where I'm sure that's the lens that we're all coming from, as opposed to the more traditional medical model of disability, which says her impairment is the problem. They should cure her or give her prosthetics. Okay. So I'm ready to ask you to watch this quick video clip and then give me your thoughts in the chat. So warning you all here, right, that I'm looking for some input. What I want to do here, I've been talking a lot. So I've also talked about the importance of hearing the voices of neurodivergent individuals. This is a video that is for an autism training through INSAR. These are actually two autistic college students, and it's only 2 minutes. On the left side here, you see I wrote the neurodiversity movement views autism as a minority identity. That's an important part of human diversity, like race, sexuality, gender, ethnicity, etc. So I want you to listen. I'll repeat the question after. but I'm layering here, thinking about, of course, doing away with deficit language and only thinking about strengths-based language using neurodiversity and the neurodiversity paradigm to make sure we're respectful of differences. Thinking about the need for social justice and adding neurodiversity to the diversity conversations that are happening nationally. And now I want you to think about these two students as individuals. What do you think considering that people want to cure them does to their self-perception, their mental health, their identity development?
Does everyone wish autism can be cured?
Well, honestly, me personally, I don't want to be cured because I know if I was cured and suddenly became magically neurotypical, I wouldn't be the same person. I feel like autism makes me a better person. It makes me more empathetic and understand of people with differences.
And honestly, let me just say this right now. The only cure for autism is a time machine. Because remember, it is a developmental disorder. Keyword, developmental. That means you would have to go back in time and rewire a baby's brain, which is
impossible.
Not necessarily impossible, but quite unethical in many ways. And try to rewire them so that they could lead quote-unquote normal lives. If people actually understood what it would take to quote-unquote cure autism,
it's a pretty risky surgery.
People would understand exactly how ridiculous it is. However,
because look at the last time they tried rewiring people's brains, the lobotomy. It left some people without emotions and leave them severely impaired for the rest of their life.
Indeed.
Okay, so the question again that I'd like you to respond to in the chat. What do you think considering that people want to cure them does to the self-perception, the mental health, the identity development of these two autistic young adults? Thank you, Karen. Alters their self-identity. Yep, signals that they're not valued as they are. Lowers self-esteem. This is important for our focus. It's equally as important as the work that we do with academic education for our students, right? Damaging to their self-esteem. I love that the young man explained how he would never want to be a neurotypical brain because he would not be himself. I know, and it seems like you all are agreeing. I really appreciated how it seemed that the young adult on the right seemed to have a real nice emotional answer, and the other student seemed to have like a real practical answer. And collaboratively, it's pretty interesting. Makes them feel less of a person, makes them feel broken and not whole, right? This is, I bring this up as an activity here because I work now with a lot of autistic students at the college level, and I think you all would be surprised because a lot of these students are students who share and their families share that when they were in, for example, elementary school, they had very limited language. They maybe even had a one-on-one aid. They did not anticipate that they were ever going to go to college, but colleges are really increasingly providing more and more accommodations, right? But these students know that through special education, that they were trying to be cured. So students will talk about those specific teachers who made them feel that they were special because of who they are, but primarily they'll talk about feeling like they were always trying to be fixed. So we have to think about how to shift that feeling for our students. Other comments, devaluing their self-esteem makes them feel bad for being who they are. Yeah, and I'm pretty impressed with how these students handle it. I work with, I would say, a majority of students who, despite everything that I'm saying about, you know, using identity language and calling people autistic, they want nothing to do with the word autism. So, if, you know, I'll call it the A word, like it's a curse word, because they don't want to be connected to it, because anything ever related to autism for them in school has had a negative impact on their disability. So that's real. So thinking about that, I guess I have a follow-up question is, you know, how does this connect to social justice? This question, this thinking about identity development. Any ideas? How does this connect to social justice here? I'd love to be in person and have a turn and talk. Gives them a voice. Fabulous, right? That's what we need to do. We need to give our students a voice. We need to think about how marginalized these students are. And really, it's our students who benefit from high levels of support that are in their homes and don't even leave their houses, or we have them in segregated classrooms or even segregated schools, even though that inclusion is our goal, right? We really are not hearing the voices of those people. So they are part of our society, right? So as educators, you know, we need to be part of the advocacy movement to make sure that disability is considered as diversity and is part of the larger conversations about diversity that are going on. And we'll keep talking a little bit more about that. But I do also want to point out, because I asked about mental health in this question, that individuals who are neurodivergent, individuals on the autism spectrum, do have mental health diagnoses at much higher level than individuals with other disabilities or neurotypical, you know, young adults. And most commonly that's anxiety, depression, stress, and also suicidal ideation. We need to concentrate on fixing the environment. Love it. I see here, makes me think of the book Flowers for Algernon, and it's so interesting. You know, a side note, one way that as teachers we can really advocate and include the disability and the diversity conversation is by thinking about the books that we select, and also thinking about how a lot of the classic literature that we read in English classes, and they portray people with disabilities in terrible ways, and rarely is that unpacked in terms of characterization. So also teaching our students from elementary school on all of this language. What does neurodivergent mean? What's neurodiversity? What's, you know, camouflaging? When we don't talk about these things openly, it teaches our students that it's taboo, that this is something scary. So I appreciate this conversation, and I hope this is helpful to all of you. I'm loving your comments here. Okay. So one more slide here about language, and then we'll move off language. And this one, building on social justice here, ableism and disableism. I also had that in the anticipation guide, right? And that one was not true. A couple people got that. So ableism, disableism are synonyms, the first two here. They can be used interchangeably. Most commonly, people use ableism. Think of feminism, think of sexism, think of racism. Ableism is prejudice against people who are not normal, prejudice against people who are not able-bodied, discrimination or social oppression against people with a disability. The next line here, camouflaging and masking. No one disagreed with that, and that's good, right? Camouflaging and masking are also synonyms. They can be used interchangeably. This is a term that's really coming out in the comments from our neurodivergent students, K through 12, who are willing to talk about their experiences, and college students themselves. What we hear from our students is they cannot stand, first of all, social skills training, social skills groups, social skills prompting, right? And honestly, it's kind of sad, but the results show that those things are not that helpful. But what our students tell us is that what they learn from those groups is how to pretend to be normal during the day. So they try to camouflage or mask. And you think, well, maybe that's the point, but it's not, because what they tell us is they hold it together all day, get home, and then they completely fall apart because we're asking them to be someone that they're not. So camouflaging, masking, the definition is behaving in ways to pass as non-autistic or neurotypical. Okay, so you see at the bottom here, I have identity formation as sort of connecting to the 6 terms above. Disclosure and intersectionality are important terms as well. If we're able to have a full day webinar, I'd like to really look a lot more at intersectionality and identity formation. We want to think about, for example, with disclosure, how in order to receive any kind of accommodations or support services, students have to, first of all, be tested, then receive a diagnosis, then provide that diagnosis to the school system, then have an IEP or a 504 plan written, right? So there's a whole process that has to happen. And they have to be willing to have that disability label be part of their identity, or otherwise they won't receive the supports that they deserve. So, neurodiversity asks us to think a little bit about that, for example. So, like I think about at the college level, if a student needs notes from a professor, do we really have to make them go through all that? So they have to go through that whole process to be able to get notes. Students don't want to disclose because they don't want anyone to know they have a disability. So they go through without getting notes and they have worse grades. So neurodiversity paradigm would, instead think about, well, let's make a procedural shift. Why can't we just give all students notes, whether they request it, have them there as, an option for them to pick up? Let's rethink some of these policies and procedures. And then, intersectionality is important to consider as we think about our students' identity formation. And by intersectionality, I really mean the overlapping factors and traits such as ability, disability, race, gender, that are all important to the forming identity of students, as they're, preteens, teens, adolescents, and they're really at that stage where they're figuring out who they are and how they feel about themselves. Okay, so back to the anticipation guide, and then we'll move on to a new section here. We covered most of these, but let me just go back through them quickly. So person first language is the preferred language. It would be nice if it was that easy now, right? So now it's sort of this tension around, I don't know, should we be using person first language? Should we not be using? A lot of the researchers are absolutely only using identity first language. A little complicated. The DSM criteria distinguishes high functioning and low functioning. No, you do not want to use those terms. If you notice, for example, in an IEP that you have, and it states so-and-so is low functioning on the autism spectrum, you want to change that language right away, rewrite that from a strength perspective. Some of you may have participated with Drs. Elder and Damiani in strengths-based IEP writing, right? Think about what you learned there, and instead, you would rephrase that to say, so-and-so benefits from a high level of supports, and then be explicit in what those supports are. Number 3, the neurodiverse student may be reluctant to disclose their disability to others. So maybe I tried to trick you on that one, because that one, I could agree with it, but there's a problem there. And the problem is one student can't be neurodiverse. So that should say the neurodivergent student may be reluctant to disclose their disability to others. Ableism is not what it says here. Ableism is discrimination against people with disabilities. Camouflaging, that is accurate here. And number 6, even though a couple people disagreed, that is the latest CDC statistics, I believe, just released a couple months ago. Okay. So now let's think about the need for neurodiversity in education. So I only have a few slides on this topic, and they come from Thomas Armstrong. So in your Google Drive resources folder, one thing that you have is a document with a whole bunch of books that are recommended. And there's some great books in there. So you have that LRC team, if you want to throw that link in there as well. This book, Neurotribes, is really great if you just want to get into thinking about neurodiversity. It's a whole bunch of short sections about neurodiversity. But I also came across recently some books and online articles from Thomas Armstrong. This one is Neurodiversity in the Classroom. What I love about it is there's page after page of strength-based checklists. So I really want to draw your attention to this book. So, neurodiversity strength checklist by category, social strengths, and there's a whole bunch of them. Communication strengths, there's a whole bunch of them. Personal strengths, cognitive strengths, emotional strengths, creative strengths. And I highly recommend this, and I think it would really be great for IEP writing as well. So what I have on the next few slides are some sort of pieces of information that I took from some of these documents from Thomas Armstrong. So this first one, the link to the article is here at the bottom of the page, but he had a table which is much longer on the tale of 2 special education paradigms. So on the left side, we think about traditional special education, which is more focused on the medical model and deficit-based. And on the right side, elements of a strength-based special ed program, which is grounded in neurodiversity. So the main shift in terms of focus would be, instead of thinking about our job as being to remediate disability, it's to promote acceptance of diversity. So disability versus diversity. Second line here for instruction, remediating deficits needs to shift to building strengths to overcome challenges. In terms of program goals, meeting instructional objectives needs to shift to developing human potential. In terms of student goals, learning to live with your disability, that absolutely needs to shift, shift that is identity crushing, right? We need to shift that focus to supporting our students to learn to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. So Armstrong has another article here, and this is an online article you can pull up as well. And he lists 8 reasons why we need neurodiversity in education. I thought this was a pretty good list, so I want to share this as well. The first one is high expectations lead to high achievement. And we all know as educators that high expectations, that's really important, right? High expectations do increase student outcomes. As I mentioned, it's important for us to communicate too at the post-secondary level with those of you at the elementary level and in between, so that we see what is happening with our students who are neurodivergent, what are their successes, and we have a real picture of what their path can be, because students are reaching the college level and they're being increasingly successful, and high expectations go a long way. If we could support students with the opportunities and supports that are available to them from a younger age, that could only really support increasing the percentages of students who are successful. The second one, we need a growth paradigm to replace a deficit paradigm. I agree with that, right? I get it that labels can be problematic, but then the practical special educator side of me as well knows we need something. So we do need a growth paradigm to replace a deficit paradigm. And this is some of the policy, the procedure work that we need to do collaboratively. Neurodiversity supports the inclusion movement. Absolutely, right? Centering students with disabilities in the classroom is the key of successful inclusion. I am all for inclusion, but none of us want to work placing students in inclusive settings if the right supports are not in place. We never want to set students up unless we know they can be successful. Number 4, neurodiversity aligns with the school's other programs and policies on diversity. So all of our schools, we're all in different schools and different settings, right? But all of our schools have policies that promote the value of diversity. They also promote hiring faculty and teachers of diversity. The more we can get faculty, teachers, principals, administrators to disclose that they are neurodivergent, the more that it is respected and thought of as disability. So that's really important as well. It's something we're also working on at our university to get, the adults to be comfortable with saying, hey, I'm ADHD. Here's how I work on my executive functioning, and to share that kind of input with our students, right? So overall there, in terms of, policies on diversity, it's important that programs include in lessons and policies promoting equity in learning, that disability is included in those equity conversations. That may relate to number 5, neurodiversity helps to stimulate real reform in our schools, and more so in terms of the inclusion reform that's needed. We often need inclusion reform. We probably need it in different levels based on what grade level we teach, what schools we're in. But thinking about neurodiversity as we really picture what the ultimate special education scenario would be, helps support that kind of reform. Number 6, neurodiversity helps reduce bullying in schools. So when we project a positive image of diversity, including neurodiversity, it makes students more comfortable with it. That makes people with differences less of a target. This is important from the time our students are young. Neurodivergent individuals can change the world. That makes me think back to number 1 here. We need to have high expectations for our students because they are, able to do wonderful things. And number 8, we need a diversity of minds to be prepared for whatever may happen in the future. We don't need one kind of learner. This one makes me think of Howard Gardner, multiple intelligences, right? We need a diversity of minds and we need to be respectful of that. I'm going to skip through this one here. Okay, so back to the chat because I have again been talking a lot here. This is a tricky question. What socially constructed barriers, policies, or procedures exist for neurodivergent students in our schools? So, for example, I mentioned that earlier. We want to think about the easy to answer question, right? What socially constructed barriers are there for people with physical disabilities? There's a staircase, there's a doorway, there's not enough room in the bathroom. Those are the easy ones to come up with. Can you come up with one example of a socially constructed procedure or socially constructed policy for neurodivergent students, either in your school or in some other school that you heard about? And I'll make it easy and I'll give you an example first. So at the university level, we have all these students taking online courses now. And for whatever reason, our typical procedure or policy has been that our online courses have timed quizzes. That's a socially constructed barrier for our neurodivergent students, right? They need to go through the whole gamut to get accommodations, and then they have to bring that accommodation letter to me as the faculty member. I need to communicate it back to the university, and then typically they're granted 1.5 time. I don't know whoever came up with that arbitrary procedure, right? So it makes me think about that procedure. Why do we need timed quizzes at all? Do we need to rethink this socially constructed barrier? So there's an example. Can you all try to come up with one? I recognize it's tough. I'll give some wait time.
Amy, also, if we could just ask everybody, as long as they're comfortable sharing with everyone, when
Yeah.
you're sharing in the chat, there's a drop-down box next to two, and you can select all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So if everyone, a lot of people are doing it, some people haven't had the chance to do that yet, but if you could just select all panelists and attendees, then everybody can see that, the input, because there's lots of great things coming in, and we just want to make sure that all participants can see. So as long as people are comfortable, if it's something they don't want to share with everyone, that's fine. But if they're comfortable sharing, just select that in that two drop-down box, okay?
Thank you.
Sorry for the interruption, but I
No,
just
thank you very much. Couple of great examples that I see here. Well, yeah, lefty and always had to sit at a righty desk. That's crazy. We have, yep. Team-based activities, yeah. PE classes. I think there are a lot of things there that we could work on. Community service hours, interesting. Yeah, paper and pencil tests. If we have a full day workshop, I think what we would probably do with the last part of the day is work on universally designing some of our lessons. And a big part of that would be rethinking assessments and what assessments look like. Great examples. I mean, another one that I can think about, you know, I guess I already mentioned copies of notes, but, you know, also students need special permission to be able to record in class. They need, oh, noise canceling, that's what I was just thinking about, the sounds. Yep, noise canceling headphones. Great. Yep, some good examples. And now that we've posed a question and we're chatting about it, you'll start to notice more. So I guarantee within the next week, especially if you were in a school building, they start to become more and more visible to you as you start to think about this and rethink these procedures. Mobility within the class. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for these. Okay, so I'm going to move into the fourth section here, and this is more for those of you who are here primarily for tips for what to do in your classroom, right? I know some of you are looking for ideas. So what services and supports can we provide that neurodivergent people want? This is more a rhetorical question here. You don't have to put it in the chat, right? Accommodations and supports. We want to always frame things from a strength perspective. So I'm giving 6 different ideas here, or first steps or priorities for your school or classroom that are proactive, positively framed accommodations and supports. I would be remiss if I didn't have the first bullet point as ensuring that everyone has a means for communication. That always has to be our first step. Then we want to build on academic strengths. We want to provide mental health supports, provide clear roles in social situations, support students with executive functioning skills, and also provide sensory-friendly spaces. So we'll look at a slide, just one slide on each of these, and I'll share some information. And again, if you have other tips or questions or ideas, feel free to put them in the chat. So communication is a human right. I read that quote from the Autistic South advocate, Jacqueline Den Houten, right, where she talked about support needs. I have another quote here from her on the 3rd bullet point. She says, there's an underrepresented group of autistic people with high support needs that must be given the means, support, self-belief, or opportunities needed in order to be heard. This is challenging work. This is where there is often a tension in terms of considering neurodiversity. One thing we'll do if we have a full webinar is look at misconceptions and tensions around neurodiversity as well. And one of the tensions is, how do we always use a strength-based perspective when we're working with students who have those real significant support needs, right? Communication is always the place to start. So students with limited or unreliable speech must be supported with alternative communication, assistive technology, whether it's high tech or low tech. And we want to make sure that everybody has a means to communicate. In terms of future webinars or other webinars or expertise at Rowan, I'm looking at these different categories and I'm thinking of other faculty that we have. So if there's interest in some of these areas, jot it down. So when you fill out the evaluation at the end, you can recommend that we target something in a future webinar. I'm thinking of Dr. Casey Woodfield's like really big with communication and autism. She could do something lovely. I'd be happy to work on that with her. All right, building on academic strengths is the second one. So I had shared in the resources folder also the full article that I referred to earlier that I worked on with faculty at 4 universities. And it's the paper called College Access, Success, and Equity. And we really worked to elicit the voices of students by first giving them surveys, then asking what students were interested in follow-up interviews, sitting one-on-one and interviewing students and asking them all kinds of questions about their experiences, what led to them getting to college, what really were factors that promoted success, what were obstacles to success, and it was pretty interesting stuff. We often think about our neurodivergent students and we think of everything but academics. We think, oh, wow, they really have social issues, they have emotional issues. Let me tell you, academics are what they want. So when we talk to them, their most preferred supports were identified as that extended time on tests, as working with academic coaches, as having access to tutoring, as receiving copies of notes. So on one hand, to me, it's interesting because I think, oh, this is really meaningful, right? We need to think about the fact that academic support is what autistic and neurodivergent students want. But then on the other hand, I can't help but think, can't we universally design support so that everything students are asking for here is always available for all students? Shouldn't all students be able to have a little extra time to finish the test if they need it? Shouldn't they all have access to a copy of notes if it helps them, or to some tutoring or academic coaching? So it really helps think about, the bigger picture policies and procedures that sometimes we don't question and we need to start to question. Okay, so this also makes me think back to Dr. Damiani and who was it? Dr. They did the strength-based IEPs, and Dr. Elder. So that information would probably provide a lot of good resources here as well. So also in terms of the research that we did across multiple universities, when we asked our autistic students to identify barriers in getting to college and having success at college, they shared mental health conditions as a major barrier. So we talked about briefly social justice and really that connection to identity formation. We need to connect it to mental health as well, right? Emotional health, trauma, anxiety, these are all real needs that must be met. So hopefully some of you also worked with Dr. Kara Aiva and her webinar, information that you all know so much about in terms of like trauma-informed practice. That's all very relevant to our neurodivergent students. So thinking about how we can socially and emotionally support our students to build their strengths, their identities, their individual identities from the onset is really important. The first 2 bullet points here I will mention just because they're interesting. They also identified major barriers as limited understanding by faculty and lacking understanding of their own disability. So they do that identity work around the time, they're getting out of high school, they get to college, and suddenly they're rethinking their identity. And a lot of them have never unpacked what disability is because people just don't talk about it enough. So that is happening and really impacting mental health. And it's something that needs to happen earlier in the K-12 grades. providing support for social situations. So hands down, the least preferred in our research, we gave students a list of accommodations that are available. We asked open-ended questions. We interviewed them. No matter what we did, they shared that they don't want any parts of social skills groups, right? But we do know that our students need their strengths to be built upon. So here are some bullet points on how I recommend to do that. One would be to limit unstructured social time. What's really important for our neurodivergent students is that they clearly understand what their role is in social situations and interactions. So, you know, game-based play is good because structured games provide roles, right? So that's kind of the strength work you can do ahead of time so that then when they're in a larger group, they are able to understand what their role is and participate without high levels of anxiety. It's also always important to rotate those roles with predictability, so it's not the students with special education who are acting in a certain way. Maintaining routine, considering sensory needs, not prompting verbally, using nonverbal communication is really essential. And then towards the bottom of the slide here, I talk about, you know, that a lot of people use peer buddies, and peer buddies are okay. What's important though is you want to match neurodivergent students with a partner that's at a similar support level to them. You know, if you match them with another student who is acting like a little adult, they will just prompt them or shift too much, you know, the natural dynamics, and it really does not bode well. So it's also important to always reverse the peer buddy roles. So if you're having students work together with one peer, maybe there's some kind of a pattern that's clear and they reverse back and forth so they know the expectation. And then, of course, always important to leave time for sharing smiles, independent thinking, key. Okay. Executive functioning is an area of great focus for neurodivergent students. There's another book, I'm picking up my books here on the table, Michelle Rigler, Amy Rutherford, Emily Quinn, Independent Social and Study Strategies. This one's in the book list as well. There's a lot going on in this book, but what I like is there are specific pages focused on executive functioning that I think are pretty cool. So like one, you know, you have students on their own think about their skills in different categories such as task initiation, action planning, maintaining effort, managing emotions, sustaining effort, working memory, and then set goals around those. So it links executive functioning to self-reflection, self-planning through some nice tools. The good news about executive functioning is that executive functioning skills do improve with practice. So these skills need to be explicitly taught. And let's face it, all students in our class benefit from this. Even our real organized students who already are focused and, you know, maintaining attention, they will still benefit and improve with specific time spent building executive functioning skills. And sensory friendly spaces, I just share 4 things to think about here. The first one are, you know, really noise and lighting are usually the big issues, right? So lighting, really bright fluorescent lighting is often a problem for individuals who are neurodivergent. It's also a problem for others as well. It's often a problem for teachers. It creates migraines, right? So thinking about how to soften lighting. Light and color also affect mood, behavior, cognitive behavior. It's a sunny day and you have windows, maybe you can just leave the light off, right? Acoustics and sound, anything you can do to minimize sound in your classroom. It's also always appropriate to try to find out ahead of time, you know, when there's fire drills, for example, or when there's going to be something loud, and to let your neurodivergent students know that that's coming so they're prepared. Okay. In terms of spatial configuration, you want your room to look like an orderly space. You want to maybe have flexible setups and just thinking about the fact that less is more. I'll relate that to materials as well, right? Less is more. We don't want to overdo it with furniture, walls, materials. And, I've heard from teachers who also think that their principals, their, administrators expect when they come around and they look at the classrooms at the beginning of the year that everything looks real colorful and full and inviting. So it may be one of those conversations that you all also have in, PLCs or some kind of, team time where you talk about, let's try to put less up. We rotate what we have to make it more meaningful. But let's also try, for example, if we have 2 walls that are really full, to maybe have a space that's just, some earth-toned walls with really nothing on the wall, so that students can rotate and sit there and get that calming effect when they need to or when they're working. We also want to think about things like sensory boxes or fidgets and having things like that readily available for everyone. I've been thinking about the fact with COVID that makes things a little tougher. Even at our university, we will often share like boxes of fidgets at a meeting. And I mean, we're adults, right? We enjoy picking them up and playing with them while we're thinking at meetings. So that's something that we encourage when we can make sure that we're not sharing germs. So I know I'm going through that, this quickly, but just some tips for those of you who are really here to think about what to do to set up for the beginning of the year. All right, so our last section is universal design and universal design for learning. So the question here, what methods can we use to design inclusive environments that center all individuals in the physical environment and in the learning activities? The answers are universal design and also universal design for learning. So universal design stems from architecture. You think how historically we created curb cuts for wheelchair users. And then what happened was we realized, hey, these are great. Bike riders can use them. Families pushing strollers can use the curb cuts. We realized that universally they benefit everyone, right? That's the core of universal design. Building things from the onset to expect diversity. All kinds of diversity, including ability diversity. So creating from the onset spaces that are accessible for everyone. So you think about new home construction now, and instead of round doorknobs, we use levers because they're easier for people to maneuver, lowered light switches. So both children and the elderly can have things be more accessible. So you all have probably seen this little graphic before, but to keep you engaged with me here, stop and consider, put it in the chat box. How can the space you see here be universally designed so everyone can see? Anyone else? I'm seeing comments about lowering the wall or lowering the fence or providing stools. Oh, remove the fence. Making more glass. So thinking about the fact that what we really want to do, what is that fence? It's a socially created obstacle, right? How do we remove the socially created obstacle? Put holes in the fence. Okay, we got the idea now. Let's look at the next slide. And you'll see some of our social justice terms that we've been working with here as well. So some people had the ideas of boxes, right? It's interesting to look at the far left, equality. So if we all believe in equality, then everybody needs the same exact box. That may work, it may not work. You see the one girl or boy, where that one person still can't see. Equity, yep, we gave them a box to stand on. But our goal here is really removing that socially constructed obstacle from the onset. So never putting that wall, because we knew that we wanted to make sure that the soccer field was always accessible to everyone. So those of you who said remove the wall or make the wall, glass or see-through, that's what we were going for here. So the concept of universal design then gets applied to learning, and that's where it gets a little more complicated, right? Because what we then need to do is think about, how do we universally design our lessons, our classroom environment, our assessments, our instruction? So from the onset, we're planning for diversity and expecting diversity in our schools. So I'm going to give you some of the foundational background on UDL here. So UDL considers 3 major networks in the brain, and this comes from the work of Vygotsky back in the 60s. So Vygotsky had said that, when you learn something new, there are really 3 processes that happen. First, you recognize the new information to be learned. Second, you apply some strategies to process that information. And third, you engage with the learning task. So UDL considers this as 3 networks. They call them the recognition, the strategic, and the effective network. And this then relates to the way we plan lessons in our classroom. So we'll look at each one individually here. So the recognition network, right, how we gather facts, how we categorize that new information that we're taking in, that's called the what of learning. So our role as educators is really what's in the purple box here. Our role of educators is to provide multiple, by multiple I mean options and choices. It's always options and choices. To provide multiple means of representation. In other words, multiple means of presenting what we want our students to learn. So we need to present information and content in a variety of ways to support understanding by students with different abilities. So, we can present information through something that students read visually, that they see, through hands-on learning that they engage with, through music, right? But thinking about how we can provide options and choice repeatedly through our learning. The second one, strategic network, we call the how of learning. So this is, once you get new information, how do we organize and express those ideas? How do we write an essay or solve a math problem? What are the strategies that we use? So our role as educators is to provide multiple means of action and expression for our students. So in other words, we should offer options for our students to demonstrate their learning. So earlier, someone said that a barrier, a socially constructed barrier, is paper and pencil tests. This speaks to that, right? What other options can we provide for our students to demonstrate their learning in various ways? And then the effective network is the why of learning, why we engaged, how learners get and stay motivated, their interest levels, what helps them stay focused. So as educators, our role here is to provide options and choices. They word it as multiple means, so how to provide multiple means of engagement, how to stimulate enthusiasm, motivation, how to promote learning, and various ways of engaging with material. So this is UDL sort of in a very general overview. Some of the application questions that I would ask that you reflect upon are here in this next slide. So how do you take these bigger UDL ideas and apply them to the classroom, right? Options and choices are really always the go-to with UDL. You want to think about things like, the materials that you have in your classroom. What materials can you always have readily on hand that can be an option for students to use? So let's say that you are doing, reading tasks. Could you always have a variety of graphic organizers on hand, for example, that students can use when they'll support them in a task? Can you always have certain technology on hand that students can use as an option? So thinking about some of those areas. So in terms of the left side of this table, multiple means of representation, the what? Your self-assessment question as you're planning, what methods am I using to teach? What variety and methods can I add? In terms of multiple means of action and expression, the how of learning. How do my students demonstrate their learning in my classroom? Am I unmeaningfully really kind of falling into the trap of all traditional tests and assessments? What options can I provide instead? And assessments can have options too, right? So it can be, at the end of our unit, you have a choice. You can show what you've learned through this art type of project, through a paper and pencil test, through, developing a video. You can have options throughout. Each student should not have to express what they've learned and engage in the same way. And then the third one here, the multiple means of engagement, always thinking about why is this learning important and how you're engaging and motivating your students. Okay, so as an example, one thing I've created here, I labeled it tic-tac-toe. I'll also often call it a think-tac-toe. This is just a choice board. Now this choice board doesn't have any real great graphics on it or anything. This was something I created for students in teacher preparation to help them understand universal design for learning. So the directions here are that the students get to choose which activities they want to complete, but they have to pick 3 in a row. Choice boards are awesome. That's another thing that perhaps we can work on if we have a full day webinar, spend the afternoon working on some assessments and maybe creating some choice boards as lessons. So for example, I would have another paper that really gives direction for all 9 of these tasks. And just in a nutshell though, let's say you're a speech pathologist, number 8 might stand out, right? A speech language pathologist connection. So maybe I think, hey, I really am interested in that because I'm interested in speech pathology. I also like self-assessment and reflection, so I'm going to do 7, 8, and 9. I may be more of a practical person. I really don't know much about UDL. I want the basics. I'm going to go 1, 5, 9 diagonally. The basics of multiple means of representation, action, expression, and engagement, right? So there's that choice involved. Some of them watch a video, some of them are a paper pencil task. That varies. In your, again, Google Drive resource folder, I have a document entitled Universal UDL. And this tic-tac-toe board is there so that you all can work through it if you'd like. There's also before this a table with multiple online links to UDL resources and strategies. So in addition to Universal Design for Learning, there's also Universal Design for Instruction. There are some other key pieces. If you all are interested in a webinar on universal design, let us know that as well. I know I've mentioned some of the other faculty members I work with, Dr. Justin Friedman and Alicia Drellick. I know they're also big with UDL. So again, among all of us, I'm sure that's something that we would be happy to put together for you all. So I am wrapping it up here. What I want to also point out to you all are the other items that I have in the resources folder. I have a document that is called Neurodiversity One-on-One, and that's just a big graphic and a handout. I decided to share that because I think that that is something that, again, if you're interested in creating like professional learning community materials or something to share with your colleagues back at your school systems, that might be something that you want to share. And there is the book and book link there. In that book and book link resource, the first 2 books are free online. So all you need to do is click and you get the full book. Both of those books are fabulous because they are written from autistic self-advocates, autistic people. One of them is a link that has, and I'm forgetting if it's from, I don't have it in front of me, if it's from Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And it has books to really also help students with identity formation if they are autistic. So if you need a resource to give to a student, for example, that's newly diagnosed, that would be something that you could provide to them as well. There is also Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone, which is another universal design resource that you could potentially use in your own classroom. Okay, so I would like to now turn it over to Q&A, questions, any final comments, and again, any suggestions for how we can follow up with a potential full webinar.
If anybody has any specific questions on anything that was covered today, if you want to put that in the Q&A or you can ask in the chat, then you have an opportunity to hear from Amy on that. Amy, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your knowledge and for all the time you put into preparing for this and for being available to do this virtually, since I know that in-person experience is different, but we do appreciate you doing this so we can at least share as best we can at this time, right?
Yes, I see requests for the links to the free book. Let me try to pull that up. Hold on. Stop share.
Well, Dr. Ricardo's looking for that link. As you're exiting, you will have an evaluation survey that'll pop up. And if you don't mind, if you're filling that out, if there are topics that were discussed today that you do want to hear more about, please share as Amy asked, so that we can, shape the trainings that we do in the future to make sure that we are addressing things that people really want to hear about. If
I'm
you
slow
are
here
not,
with my screen sharing. I apologize, but I think
it's okay.
I'm getting there.
If you can't find it now, I can share it out via an email to everybody who participated. I can do that too. So.
Any of you have the link to that? That's what I'm looking for. The link to the document that is resources, books, and links.
I think Judy did share that out in the chat earlier. Let's see. Oh, all right. Judy just put that back into the chat.
Thank you. Okay, great. So if you can click on what Judy just put on the chat, click on that link in the chat. That is going to bring you to the document with books, and you'll see the first two are open access. So the first one is called Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement, Stories from the Front Line, and the direct link is there. Hopefully that's working out. And then the second one is called Increasing Neurodiversity and Disability and Social Justice Advocacy Groups. It's Nothing About Us Without Us. That's like a white paper about neurodiversity. So it's similar to a book with a lot of fabulous information in it. I also put another link. I'm actually not sure about copyright here, but it was online. You know how I mentioned this book from Thomas Armstrong, this neurodiversity book? They're online as a strengths checklist. So I mentioned that what I really like in that book is that there are a whole lot of strengths-based checklists. I put a link to a document I found from Montgomery Schools on the second page of that book resource. If you click that, it'll bring you to some wonderful strengths checklists.
Amy, we have something about a chat comment in saying that many teachers are struggling to support their students with virtual learning during COVID. Can we have more resources for teaching students with autism virtually?
Yeah, I'll have to say, I agree. It's very difficult. It's a big tension to figure out, how best to support our students with autism virtually. That is something that, we could try to pull together. I think that what I'm hearing from parents, right, you know, I wear different hats, so I'm also part of a lot of parent networks, is that parents are shutting down and really not wanting to participate in some of the online teaching anymore because they're feeling like they're wrestling to keep their son or daughter just sitting in a chair to engage. So I think what we really need to do is chunk those sessions beyond the tools. I think we need to chunk those sessions into like 10, 15-minute virtual learning experiences, and to giving parents some expectations of what to do in terms of really brief schedules throughout the day as well. And I think that in some ways is supporting the families better than expecting our students to sit in front of a screen and engage. I don't know if that's helpful.
Okay, we have another, which is, I'm curious about social skills and pragmatic language instruction is provided in this paradigm.
Terrific. So everything in the neurodiversity paradigm is from the perspective of building on strengths. So meeting students where they are and building on their strengths. So in terms of teaching pragmatic language, it would be, you know, more natural environment type learning, building on students' strengths. I hope that answers your question. Let me see if I missed any others. Thank you for all the thank yous. That is terrific.
Always nice to hear thank you, right? I don't see that we don't have any additional, nothing additional in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you,
Hope to see you
everybody.
in person.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Bye.
All right, we have concluded our webinar. Please be sure to complete the evaluation survey, and then we will get professional development certificates out to all of you. And thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being here with us. All right, our participants are leaving. Amy, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting, and then
Okay.
I hope you have a great day.
All right, you too. Thank you. Hey, I have a quick question. So when you
So
send
hold
them,
on one sec, just so you know, there are still about 10 participants on. So if you want, you want me to reach out
that's
to you?
okay. I can ask you later. Thanks.
All right,
Bye.
bye. Bye.